The crimson sunset painted the horizon as dust swirled across the barren trail leading into Gonzales, Texas. Matthew Callahan shifted in his saddle, his weathered hands guiding his chestnut mare through the growing darkness of 1875. The 30-year-old cowboy had been on the trail for weeks, driving cattle from San Antonio back to his modest ranch outside of town. His body ached for a real bed and a hot meal that wasn't beans cooked over an open fire. The rhythmic clop of hooves against packed earth was the only sound for miles until a strange noise caught Matthew's attention. He pulled on the reins, bringing his horse to a stop. Tilting his head, he listened. The sound came again, faint, high-pitched, almost like a baby. Matthew muttered to himself, disbelief etched on his sun-bronzed face. He dismounted, boots hitting the ground with a thud, and followed the cries that seemed to be coming from just off the trail. The dusk made it difficult to see, but as he approached a cluster of scrub brush, the wailing grew louder. Matthew pushed aside a tangled mess of mesquite, revealing a small bundle wrapped in a faded quilt. "Lord Almighty," he breathed, kneeling down beside what was unmistakably an infant. The baby, red-faced from crying, couldn't have been more than a few months old. Matthew gently pulled back the quilt to reveal a tiny girl with wisps of dark hair. Beside her lay a folded piece of paper, its edges fluttering in the evening breeze. With trembling fingers, Matthew picked up the note and unfolded it. The handwriting was shaky but legible. "Her name is Elizabeth. I cannot care for her anymore. Please give her a better life than I could. May God forgive me." There was no signature, no explanation of who had left this child or why. Just a desperate plea from someone who had reached the end of their rope. Matthew looked down at the infant, who had momentarily stopped crying and was staring up at him with dark eyes. Something stirred within him, a protective instinct he didn't know he possessed. "Bring her home with me," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the evening breeze. Without another moment's hesitation, Matthew carefully scooped up the child and the note, cradling the baby against his chest. He walked back to his horse, who nickered softly at his approach. "It's all right, girl," he murmured to the mare. "We've got precious cargo now." Matthew fashioned a makeshift sling from his bandana and secured the baby against his chest. He knew he needed to get her to town quickly. The nights were cold and the infant needed proper food and care. As he mounted his horse, the reality of what he was doing hit him. He was a bachelor, a man who spent more time with cattle than people. What did he know about caring for a baby? Yet he couldn't imagine leaving her. Something about those innocent eyes had reached deep into his soul and taken hold. "Well, little Elizabeth," he said softly as he nudged his horse into motion, "I reckon we're in this together now." The ride into Gonzales seemed longer than usual. Every jolt of the horse made Matthew anxious for the baby's comfort. He held her firmly but gently against his chest, whispering reassurances when she fussed. The lights of the town eventually came into view, twinkling like stars fallen to earth. Matthew headed straight for Doc Wilson's place on the edge of town. The doctor had been serving Gonzales for over 20 years and was known for his kindness and discretion. Light spilled from the windows of the modest clapboard house that doubled as a medical office, indicating the doctor was still awake. Matthew dismounted carefully, adjusting the precious bundle against his chest before tying his horse to the hitching post. He took a deep breath and knocked on the door. After a moment, the door swung open to reveal Samuel Wilson, a man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "Matthew Callahan," the doctor said, surprise evident in his voice. "What brings you by at this hour?" Before Matthew could answer, Elizabeth let out a wail. The doctor's eyes widened as he noticed the bundle against Matthew's chest. "Best come inside," Doc Wilson said, stepping back from the doorway. Once inside, Matthew explained the situation while the doctor examined the infant. Elizabeth cried through most of the examination, her tiny fists balled in protest. "She appears to be about 3 months old," Doc Wilson said, his practiced hands gentle as he checked the baby over. "Healthy from what I can tell, though she's a bit dehydrated." "What do I do, Doc?" Matthew asked, running a hand through his disheveled brown hair. "I can't just leave her with someone else. I found her. It's my responsibility." The doctor gave Matthew a long, appraising look. "You know, raising a child isn't like breaking a wild horse, Matthew. It's a lifetime commitment." "I know that," Matthew replied, his voice firm. "I don't make promises lightly." Doc Wilson sighed and walked over to a cabinet, pulling out a few glass bottles. "You'll need these for feeding her. Cow's milk, diluted with a bit of water and sweetened slightly. Feed her every few hours." He handed Matthew the supplies along with a small tin of cornstarch. "For diaper rash," he explained. "Diapers," Matthew muttered. "Hadn't thought of that." "You'll need a lot of things you haven't thought of," the doctor replied with a wry smile. "But for now, let's get you set up with the essentials." For the next hour, Doc Wilson gave Matthew a crash course in infant care while his wife, Martha, prepared a basket of supplies. Clean cloths for diapers, a few simple gowns, and a small blanket she had been knitting for her niece's expected baby. "The poor little thing," Martha said, gently touching Elizabeth's cheek. "Who could leave such a precious child?" "Someone desperate," Matthew replied, thinking of the note. "Someone who wanted her to have a better life." "And will she have a better life with you?" Martha asked, her eyes searching his face. Matthew met her gaze steadily. "Yes, madam. I'll make sure of it." By the time Matthew left the doctor's house, his saddlebags were filled with baby supplies and his mind was reeling with information. The town was quiet as he made his way to his horse, most folks already tucked in for the night. He mounted carefully, Elizabeth secure in her improvised sling. "Just a little further, little one," he whispered. "Then we'll be home." Matthew's ranch was modest, a small main house, a barn, and a few outbuildings spread across 50 acres of land. It wasn't much compared to some of the bigger spreads in the area, but it was his, bought with years of hard work and savings. As he approached, his ranch hand, an older man named Hank, came out to greet him. "About time you got back," Hank called, then stopped short when he noticed the bundle. "What in tarnation?" Matthew dismounted slowly, careful not to jostle Elizabeth. "Found her abandoned by the trail," he explained. "Her name's Elizabeth." Hank's weathered face showed his shock. "And you just brought her home? Couldn't leave her, Hank." The older man shook his head but stepped forward to take the reins of Matthew's horse. "Well, never figured you for a family man, boss." Matthew looked down at the sleeping infant. "Neither did I." That first night was a blur of feedings, diaper changes, and pacing the floor with a fussy baby. By dawn, Matthew was exhausted, his eyes gritty from lack of sleep. Elizabeth had finally settled into a peaceful slumber in the drawer he'd emptied and lined with blankets as a makeshift crib. He stood watching her sleep, amazed at how someone so small could completely upend his life in a matter of hours. He would need to make arrangements, get proper baby items, figure out a more permanent solution for childcare while he worked the ranch. But as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the window, illuminating Elizabeth's peaceful face, Matthew knew with certainty that he'd made the right decision. "I promise you a good life, little one," he whispered. "That's a cowboy's word." Word spread quickly through Gonzales about Matthew Callahan and the baby he'd found. By mid-morning, visitors began to arrive at his ranch, mostly women bearing casseroles, advice and curious glances. Among them was Josephine Keller, the schoolteacher who had arrived in town just last year. "Mr. Callahan," she greeted him at his door, a basket over her arm. "I hope I'm not intruding." Matthew had seen Miss Keller in town but had never spoken to her directly. She was younger than he'd expected, probably in her mid-20s, with warm brown eyes and auburn hair neatly pinned beneath a simple bonnet. "Not at all, Miss Keller," he replied, stepping back to allow her entry. "Though I'm afraid the place isn't very presentable at the moment." She smiled as she entered, taking in the bachelor's quarters with its sparse furnishings and the obvious signs of a night spent caring for an infant. "I heard about your situation from Mrs. Wilson," she explained, setting her basket on the table. "I brought some things that might help." From the basket, she withdrew several neatly sewn baby gowns, diapers, and a small knitted blanket. "These belong to my sister's children. They've outgrown them now." "That's mighty kind of you," Matthew said, genuine gratitude in his voice. "I'm a bit out of my depth here." "I imagine so," Josephine replied with a gentle smile. "May I see her?" Matthew led her to where Elizabeth was sleeping in her drawer. The baby had woken and was quietly looking around, her small fists waving in the air. "Oh, she's beautiful," Josephine breathed, bending down to get a closer look. "Hello, little Elizabeth." As if responding to her name, the baby gurgled, her face breaking into what almost looked like a smile. "She likes you," Matthew observed, surprised at the twinge of something he felt, not quite jealousy, but a protective awareness that surprised him. "Babies need a woman's touch, Mr. Callahan," Josephine said, straightening up. "Have you thought about what you'll do when you need to work?" Matthew sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Not fully, madam. I've got Hank to help with the ranch work, but as for the baby—" He trailed off. "I could help," Josephine offered, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. "School's out for summer and I have experience with infants from helping my sister." Matthew looked at her in surprise. "That's a generous offer, Miss Keller. Please call me Josephine," she said, "and it's no trouble. I've always loved children. It's why I became a teacher." There was something about her directness, her genuine concern for Elizabeth, that Matthew found refreshing. Unlike some of the other women who had visited that morning, Josephine hadn't spent her time dropping hints about her cooking skills or making comments about how a man needed a wife to raise a child properly. "I'd be grateful for the help, Josephine," he said finally. "And please call me Matthew." Over the next few days, a routine began to take shape. Josephine would arrive in the morning after Matthew had done his early chores. She would care for Elizabeth while he worked the ranch, and in the evenings, they would often share a meal before she returned to her small house in town. During these dinners, Matthew learned that Josephine had come to Gonzales after teaching in San Antonio for several years. She was unmarried, dedicated to her profession, and had a quick wit that often surprised him. She wasn't like other women he had known. She spoke her mind and had opinions on everything from politics to ranching. "Why Gonzales?" he asked one evening as they sat on his porch, watching the sunset while Elizabeth slept inside. "Seems a small place for someone with your education." Josephine was silent for a moment, her eyes on the horizon. "I needed a fresh start," she said finally. San Antonio held painful memories. There was something in her voice that made Matthew decide not to press further. Everyone had parts of their past they preferred not to discuss. He certainly did. "Well, Gonzales is lucky to have you," he said instead. "And so are we." She smiled at that, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "It seems we all found each other when we needed to." As the weeks passed, Elizabeth grew and thrived under their care. Matthew found himself increasingly looking forward to the evenings, when the three of them would be together. He began to notice things about Josephine that he hadn't before: the way her eyes crinkled when she laughed, How deftly her hands worked when she showed him how to properly swaddle Elizabeth, the scent of lavender that seemed to follow her. One afternoon in late July, Matthew returned from checking fences to find Josephine sitting on the porch rocker, humming softly to Elizabeth. The baby was looking up at her with rapt attention, her little hand wrapped around Josephine's finger. The scene struck Matthew so powerfully that he stopped in his tracks. In that moment, he could imagine a future one where evenings like this weren't temporary arrangements but the foundation of a family. The thought both exhilarated and terrified him. Josephine looked up, noticing him, and smiled. "You're back early," she said. "The fence wasn't as damaged as I feared," he replied, climbing the steps to join them. "How's our girl?" "Perfect," Josephine said, looking down at Elizabeth with a tenderness that made Matthew's heart constrict. "She's been an angel all day." Matthew sat on the step beside the rocker, watching them. "You're good with her," he said softly. "Better than I am." "That's not true," Josephine protested. "You've taken to fatherhood remarkably well for someone who had it thrust upon him so suddenly." "I still don't know what I'm doing half the time," Matthew admitted. "Last night she was crying and I tried everything: feeding, changing, walking. Nothing worked until I started talking to her about cattle breeding, of all things. She was asleep before I finished explaining bloodlines." Josephine laughed, the sound like music in the quiet evening. "She probably found it as fascinating as I would." "Are you saying my conversations are dull, Miss Keller?" Matthew teased, enjoying the flush that rose to her cheeks. "Not at all, Mr. Callahan," she replied with mock formality. "Just perhaps not my area of expertise." "And what is your area of expertise beyond teaching and baby tending?" Josephine considered for a moment. "Books," she said finally. "I love to read. Everything from Greek philosophy to dime novels." Matthew raised his eyebrows. "Dime novels?" "The schoolteacher reads tales of outlaws and gunfights. Even schoolteachers need escape sometimes," she said with a mischievous smile. "What about you? What do you do when you're not being a cowboy or a father?" The question caught Matthew off guard. It had been so long since he had thought about what he enjoyed beyond working and, lately, caring for Elizabeth. "I used to whittle," he said, remembering. "Made little figures and such. Haven't done it in some time, though." "You should start again," Josephine suggested. "You could make toys for Elizabeth when she's older." The thought warmed Matthew. "I suppose I could at that." They fell into comfortable silence, watching as the sun dipped lower on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Elizabeth had drifted off to sleep, her tiny chest rising and falling steadily. "I should be getting back to town," Josephine said eventually, though she made no move to rise. "Stay for supper," Matthew said, the words coming out before he could think better of them. "I mean, if you'd like to." "Nothing fancy, just some stew I put on this morning." Josephine hesitated, then nodded. "I'd like that." As they moved inside, Matthew couldn't help but notice how right it felt having Josephine in his home. She moved about his kitchen with a familiarity born of the past weeks, helping him set the table while he checked on the stew. They ate by lamplight, talking easily about the town, the ranch, and Elizabeth's progress. After the meal, Josephine insisted on helping with the dishes, standing beside him at the wash basin. "Thank you," Matthew said as they worked. "Not just for tonight, but for everything you've done for Elizabeth, for us." Josephine paused, a plate in her hands. "You don't need to thank me. I've come to care for Elizabeth very much." She hesitated before adding softly, "For both of you." Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. Matthew had the sudden, overwhelming urge to lean down and kiss her, but before he could move, Elizabeth's cry broke the moment. "I'll get her," Josephine said quickly, Setting down the plate and moving toward the makeshift nursery Matthew had set up in the small room off the main living area. Matthew watched her go, his heart pounding in his chest. What was happening to him? Was he falling in love with Josephine Keller? The question lingered in his mind long after Josephine had left for the night, promising to return in the morning. As he lay in bed, Elizabeth sleeping peacefully in her newly acquired crib, a gift from the town carpenter, Matthew stared at the ceiling and admitted to himself what he had been denying for weeks. Yes, he was falling in love with Josephine, and it terrified him. August brought relentless heat to Central Texas, the kind that seemed to slow time itself. The ranch work continued despite the scorching temperatures, and Matthew found himself increasingly grateful for Josephine's presence. Not only did she care for Elizabeth with loving attention, but she had also become someone he looked forward to seeing each day, someone whose opinions he valued and whose company he craved. One particularly hot afternoon, Matthew returned to the house earlier than usual, having sent his ranch hands home to escape the worst of the heat. He found Josephine sitting on the floor of the main room, reading aloud from a book of children's stories to Elizabeth, who was lying on a blanket, cooing and reaching for Josephine's hair. The domestic scene made Matthew pause in the doorway, watching silently. Josephine's voice was animated as she read, changing tones for different characters and using her free hand to gesture expressively. Elizabeth seemed entranced, her eyes following Josephine's every movement. "And the brave knight rescued the princess," Josephine read, then looked up, noticing Matthew. "Oh, I didn't hear you come in." "Don't stop on my account," Matthew said, removing his hat and hanging it on a peg by the door. "Sounds like it was just getting to the good part." Josephine smiled, marking her place in the book. "I'm afraid the ending is quite predictable. The knight and princess live happily ever after, as they always do in these stories." "Nothing wrong with a happy ending," Matthew replied, crossing the room to kneel beside Elizabeth. He gently tickled her belly, delighting in the gurgling laugh it produced. "How's my girl today?" "She's been wonderful," Josephine said, watching them with soft eyes. "She's trying to roll over. Watch." Sure enough, as they observed, Elizabeth strained and wiggled, almost making it onto her side before flopping back with a frustrated grunt. "Look at you," Matthew marveled, pride swelling in his chest. "You'll be running circles around me before I know it." "She's growing so fast," Josephine agreed, a hint of wistfulness in her voice. Matthew glanced at her, suddenly struck by a thought. "You've been here almost every day for over a month," he said. "Don't you ever want a day to yourself, time to do your own things?" Josephine looked surprised by the question. "I enjoy being here," she said simply. "Elizabeth is a joy and—" She trailed off, her cheeks coloring slightly. "And," Matthew prompted gently. "And I enjoy your company," she admitted, meeting his eyes. "More than I probably should." The air between them seemed to thicken. Matthew swallowed hard, gathering his courage. "I enjoy your company too, Josephine, very much." For a moment neither spoke, the only sound in the room Elizabeth's contented babbling. Then Josephine broke the silence. "I should go," she said, though she made no move to leave. "It's getting late." "Stay," Matthew said, the word hanging between them like a promise. "Please." Josephine looked at him, her expression a mixture of hope and uncertainty. "Matthew—" Whatever she was about to say was interrupted by a knock at the door. Matthew sighed, getting to his feet. "Hold that thought," he said, reluctantly moving to answer the door. He was surprised to find Sheriff Jenkins on his porch, the older man's expression grave. "Evening, Matthew," the sheriff said, removing his hat. "Mind if I come in? Got something I need to discuss with you." Matthew stepped back, allowing the sheriff entry. "Of course. "Is everything all right?" Sheriff Jenkins nodded a greeting to Josephine before turning his attention back to Matthew. "It's about the baby," he said without preamble. "A woman came into my office this morning, says she's Elizabeth's mother." The words hit Matthew like a physical blow. He felt the blood drain from his face as the room seemed to tilt around him. "What?" "Her name's Charlotte Myers," the sheriff continued. "Says she left the baby because she was desperate, had nowhere to go after her husband died. Claims she's gotten back on her feet now and wants her daughter back." Matthew felt Josephine move to stand beside him, her presence a steadying force. "Did she prove she's the mother?" Josephine asked, her voice remarkably calm despite the tremor in her hands as she reached for Matthew's arm. "Says she can describe the quilt the baby was wrapped in, and the exact wording of the note," Sheriff Jenkins replied. "Wants to meet with you tomorrow, Matthew." Matthew's mind raced. He had grown to love Elizabeth as his own. The thought of giving her up was unimaginable. Yet if this woman truly was her mother, "I'll meet with her," he said finally, his voice hollow. "Tomorrow morning at your office." After the sheriff left, Matthew sank into a chair, his head in his hands. Josephine sat opposite him, Elizabeth now cradled in her arms. "What am I going to do?" Matthew whispered. "I can't lose her, Josephine." "We don't know yet if this woman is truly her mother," Josephine said, though her voice lacked conviction. "And even if she is, we don't know her circumstances or intentions." Matthew looked up, noticing Josephine's use of "we." Despite everything, it gave him a small measure of comfort knowing he wasn't facing this alone. "I can't sleep tonight," he said. "Not with this hanging over us." Josephine nodded, understanding in her eyes. "I'll stay," she said simply. "We'll face this together, whatever comes." That night, as Elizabeth slept peacefully in her crib, unaware of the turmoil surrounding her future, Matthew and Josephine sat on the porch, talking in low voices. They shared their fears, their hopes, and eventually, as the night deepened, things they had never told anyone else. Matthew told Josephine about losing his parents at a young age, about growing up with an uncle who taught him ranching but little about love or family. Josephine, in turn, spoke of the fiancé who had betrayed her in San Antonio, leaving her for another woman just weeks before their wedding. "That's why I came to Gonzales," she admitted. "I couldn't bear the whispers, the pitying looks, his loss," Matthew said firmly. "The man was a fool." Josephine smiled sadly. "Perhaps, but it led me here to Elizabeth, to you." In the soft glow of moonlight, Matthew reached out and took her hand. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said, "I want you to know these past weeks have meant everything to me." Josephine's fingers tightened around his. "To me as well." They sat like that until dawn broke over the horizon, facing an uncertain future but drawing strength from each other's presence. The next morning, Matthew and Josephine, with Elizabeth in arms, made their way to the sheriff's office in town. The streets of Gonzales were beginning to stir with early morning activity, shopkeepers opening their doors, farmers bringing goods to market. It all seemed so normal, so unchanged, while Matthew felt as though his world was being torn apart. Sheriff Jenkins met them at the door, his expression sympathetic. "She's inside," he said quietly. "Name's Charlotte Myers, like I said. 24 years old, widow from San Antonio." Matthew nodded, steeling himself. Beside him, Josephine adjusted Elizabeth in her arms, the baby contentedly playing with the collar of Josephine's dress, oblivious to the tension around her. "I'd like Josephine to come in with me," Matthew said, not a question but a statement. The sheriff nodded, leading them into his office where a young woman sat waiting. She was thin, with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of hardship, but there was a determined set to her jaw. She stood as they entered, her eyes immediately going to Elizabeth. "My baby," she breathed, taking a step forward before stopping, uncertainty crossing her features. She's grown so much. Matthew felt his throat tighten. There was no denying the resemblance. Elizabeth had the same dark hair, the same shaped eyes. Mrs. Myers, Sheriff Jenkins said. This is Matthew Callahan, who found the child, and Josephine Keller, who has been helping care for her. Charlotte nodded at them, her gaze still fixed on Elizabeth. I want to thank you, she said, her voice thick with emotion, for taking care of my daughter when I couldn't. Where were you? The question burst from Matthew before he could stop himself, sharper than he intended. Why did you leave her alone on a trail? Charlotte flinched as if struck. I wasn't in my right mind, she said quietly. My husband died in an accident at the railroad 3 months after Elizabeth was born. I had no family, no money, nothing. I was starving, couldn't feed her properly. Tears welled in her eyes. I thought she would be better off if someone else found her, someone who could care for her properly. And now, Josephine asked, her voice gentle but firm. What's changed? I found work in San Antonio as a seamstress, Charlotte explained. I've saved money, rented a small room. It's not much, but it's clean and warm. I can provide for her now. She looked directly at Matthew. I never stopped thinking about her, never stopped loving her. She's all I have left of my husband. Matthew felt a crushing weight on his chest. How could he argue against a mother's love, against her right to raise her own child? Yet the thought of giving Elizabeth up felt like having his heart torn from his body. She's been well cared for, Josephine said, stepping forward slightly. She's thriving, happy. Her voice broke. She's loved. Charlotte's eyes softened as she looked at Josephine. I can see that, she said. And I'm grateful, truly. She hesitated. Would you? May I hold her? Matthew wanted to say no, to gather Elizabeth and Josephine and flee to protect the family they had become, but he knew he had no right. Slowly, he nodded to Josephine, who reluctantly stepped forward and placed Elizabeth in her mother's arms. Charlotte's face transformed as she held her daughter, tears flowing freely now. Hello, my sweet girl, she whispered, pressing a kiss to Elizabeth's forehead. Mama's here now. Elizabeth, usually wary of strangers, looked up at Charlotte with curious eyes. Then, to Matthew's surprise, she began to fuss, her little face scrunching up in distress as she reached out toward him and Josephine. She doesn't know me, Charlotte said, the realization clearly painful. Of course she doesn't. She just needs time, Josephine said gently, though Matthew could hear the strain in her voice. Charlotte looked down at her daughter, then up at the two people who had been caring for her. Something like understanding passed across her features. You love her, she said, not a question but a statement. Both of you. Yes, Matthew said simply. More than anything. Charlotte nodded slowly, seeming to come to a decision. She handed Elizabeth back to Josephine, the baby immediately calming as she nestled against the familiar presence. I need to think, Charlotte said, her voice steady despite the tears still on her cheeks. This isn't what I expected. She turned to Sheriff Jenkins. I'm staying at the boarding house. I'll come back tomorrow if that's all right. After Charlotte left, Matthew, Josephine, and Elizabeth remained in the sheriff's office, the future hanging uncertainly before them. She's her mother, Matthew said finally, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. She has every right to take her back. I know, Josephine whispered, holding Elizabeth closer. I know. That night back at the ranch, the atmosphere was heavy with unspoken grief. They went through the motions of their evening routine, feeding Elizabeth, bathing her, dressing her in a clean nightgown. Every action felt weighted with the knowledge that it might be one of the last times they performed these tender tasks. After Elizabeth was asleep, Matthew and Josephine sat at the kitchen table, a pot of coffee between them growing cold as neither had the heart to drink. I can't imagine waking up tomorrow and not hearing her little noises from the crib, Josephine said, breaking the long silence. "Not seeing her smile when she sees me." Matthew reached across the table and took her hand. "I keep thinking about all the things I wanted to teach her," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "How to ride a horse, how to recognize the constellations." He swallowed hard. "I wanted to see her grow up." Josephine's fingers tightened around his. "So did I." They sat like that, holding on to each other as the night deepened around them. Eventually, Matthew stood, pulling Josephine gently to her feet. "Stay tonight," he said, not letting go of her hand. "Please, I don't want to be alone." Josephine nodded, tears shining in her eyes. They moved to the small sofa in the main room, sitting close together, drawing comfort from each other's presence. Somewhere in the long hours of the night, exhaustion overcame them, and they fell asleep, Josephine's head on Matthew's shoulder, his arm protectively around her. The knock on the door came just after sunrise. Matthew jerked awake, immediately alert, his movement waking Josephine beside him. They exchanged a look of apprehension before Matthew rose to answer the door. Charlotte Myers stood on the porch, her expression resolute. "Mr. Callahan," she said formally. "May I come in?" Matthew nodded, stepping back to allow her entry. Inside, Josephine had already moved to the crib, standing protectively near the still sleeping Elizabeth. Charlotte took a deep breath, looking around the simple but comfortable home. "I spent all night thinking," she began, "about Elizabeth, about what's best for her." She met Matthew's gaze steadily. "I love my daughter, I never wanted to give her up, but seeing her yesterday, seeing how she is with you both." She paused, gathering her courage. "She has a home here. A family who loves her." Matthew felt a flicker of hope, so fragile he was almost afraid to acknowledge it. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Charlotte continued, her voice strong despite the tears welling in her eyes, "that I want what's best for Elizabeth. And I think that might be staying with you." Josephine gasped softly, her hand going to her mouth. "Are you certain?" Charlotte nodded, wiping away a tear that had escaped. "I have nothing to offer her but love. You can give her stability, a home, two parents who adore her." She looked directly at them. "That's what I want for my daughter, what I've always wanted." "Two parents," Matthew repeated, glancing at Josephine in surprise. A small smile touched Charlotte's lips despite her tears. "Anyone can see how you feel about each other. And how you both feel about Elizabeth." Matthew and Josephine exchanged a look, something unspoken passing between them. In that moment, Matthew realized that Charlotte was right. They had become a family, the three of them, bound by love if not by blood or law. "I would like to visit her," Charlotte said, her voice smaller now. "If that would be all right, to be part of her life, even if I can't be her mother in the way I had hoped." "Of course," Matthew said immediately. "She should know you, know where she came from." Charlotte nodded gratefully. "There's one more thing." She reached into her bag and pulled out a folded document. "I had this drawn up last night at the hotel. The owner's brother is a lawyer." She handed the paper to Matthew. "It's a formal relinquishment of my parental rights and consent for you to adopt Elizabeth. It just needs your signature, and your wife's." Matthew unfolded the document, scanning its contents. "We're not married," he said, looking up at Charlotte in confusion. "Not yet," she replied with a sad smile. "But I think you will be. Elizabeth deserves a mother and a father who love her. And each other." From the crib came the soft sounds of Elizabeth waking. Josephine moved to lift her, cradling her close before bringing her to where Matthew and Charlotte stood. "Would you like to hold her?" Josephine asked gently. "To say goodbye." Charlotte nodded, carefully taking Elizabeth in her arms. "Goodbye, my sweet girl," she whispered, pressing a kiss to the baby's forehead. "Be happy. Be loved. And someday understand that I did this because I love you more than my own happiness." She handed Elizabeth back to Matthew, who held the baby close, his heart full to bursting with emotions too complex to name. "Thank you," he said to Charlotte, the words inadequate for the gift she was giving them. "We'll make sure she knows how much her mother loved her." After Charlotte left, promising to return in a few days to check on Elizabeth before she went back to San Antonio, Matthew and Josephine stood in the morning light, Elizabeth between them, the future suddenly wide open before them. "Did that really happen?" Josephine asked, wonder in her voice. "Is she truly ours now?" Matthew looked at the woman beside him, at the child in his arms, and felt a certainty he had never known before. "She is," he said, if you want her to be, if you want us to be a family." Josephine's eyes met his, all her feelings laid bare. "I've never wanted anything more." Matthew shifted Elizabeth to one arm, using his free hand to gently touch Josephine's cheek. "I think I've been falling in love with you since the first day you came to help with Elizabeth," he said softly. "I just didn't know if you felt the same." "I do," Josephine whispered, leaning into his touch. "I've been so afraid to admit it, even to myself. After what happened in San Antonio, I didn't think I could trust my heart again." "And now?" Matthew asked, his heart pounding. "Now I know that sometimes the heart finds exactly what it needs, even when we're not looking for it." She smiled up at him, love shining in her eyes. "I love you, Matthew Callahan. You and Elizabeth both." Matthew bent his head, closing the distance between them in a kiss that felt like coming home. Elizabeth cooed between them, her small hand reaching out to touch Josephine's hair. "I think she approves," Matthew said with a smile when they finally parted. "Good," Josephine replied, her eyes bright with happiness, "because I'm not going anywhere. Ever." 2 months later, on a crisp October afternoon, the small church in Gonzales was filled with well-wishers as Matthew Callahan and Josephine Keller exchanged their vows. Elizabeth, now nearly 8 months old, was held by Martha Wilson during the ceremony, dressed in a tiny white gown that Josephine had lovingly sewn. "I, Matthew, take you, Josephine, to be my lawfully wedded wife," Matthew said, his voice clear and strong as he looked into the eyes of the woman who had brought such unexpected joy to his life. "To have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." Josephine, radiant in a simple cream-colored dress, returned the vows with tears of joy in her eyes. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the church erupted in cheers and applause. At the reception held at Matthew's ranch now, their ranch, Charlotte Myers was among the guests, having come from San Antonio for the wedding. She spent time holding Elizabeth, telling her stories about her birth father, creating memories that would someday help the child understand the complicated, loving decision her birth mother had made. As the celebration continued around them, Matthew pulled Josephine aside for a moment of quiet. "Happy, Mrs. Callahan?" he asked, still marveling at the fact that this remarkable woman was now his wife. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she replied, standing on tiptoe to kiss him. "We've been blessed, Matthew, in so many ways." He nodded, looking over to where Elizabeth was being passed from one adoring townsperson to another, her laughter bringing smiles to every face. "All because of a note in the dust," he mused. "Funny how life works out." "It's not just luck," Josephine said thoughtfully. "It's what we choose to do with the moments that matter. You could have left Elizabeth or given her to someone else to raise. I could have kept my distance, protected my heart. Charlotte could have insisted on taking her back." She smiled up at him. "We all chose love even when it was difficult." "Especially then." Matthew pulled her close, overwhelmed by the truth of her words and the depth of his feelings for her. "I love you, Josephine Callahan," he said against her hair, "and I'll spend every day of my life choosing you, choosing us." "As will I," she promised, her arms tightening around him. "As will I." 5 years later, the sun was setting over the expanded Callahan Ranch, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold. On the wide front porch, Josephine sat in a rocking chair, her rounded belly evidence of their third child due to arrive before winter. Beside her, Matthew worked on a small wooden horse, his skilled hands shaping the figure with care. From the yard came the sounds of children's laughter. Elizabeth, now 5 years old with her mother's dark hair and her father's determined spirit, was playing a game of tag with her 3-year-old brother James. The boy, a miniature version of Matthew with Josephine's warm eyes, shrieked with delight as his sister chased him around an oak tree. "Careful, you two," Josephine called, smiling as she watched them play. "James, don't run so fast you fall." "I won't, Mama," the boy called back, though he showed no signs of slowing. Matthew set aside his carving, reaching over to take Josephine's hand. "They have your energy," he observed with a grin. "And your stubbornness," she replied, giving his hand a squeeze. The past 5 years had brought changes to their lives. The ranch had prospered, allowing them to build additions to the house and hire more hands. Josephine continued to teach, though now she did so from home, instructing Elizabeth and several neighboring children who came to the ranch 3 days a week for lessons. Charlotte Myers visited regularly, becoming Auntie Charlotte to Elizabeth and James. She had remarried the previous year to a kind shopkeeper in San Antonio and was expecting her own child in the spring. Elizabeth's birthday letter from Charlotte arrived today, Josephine mentioned, nodding toward the envelope on the small table between them. She included a photograph of her and Edward. Matthew nodded, watching as Elizabeth finally caught her brother, both children collapsing in a giggling heap on the grass. "She looks happy in the last one. Marriage suits her." "As it does us," Josephine said softly. Matthew turned to look at his wife, still struck by how fortunate he was. At 35, he had everything he'd never known. He wanted a loving wife, beautiful children, a thriving ranch, and a heart full to bursting. "What are you thinking about?" Josephine asked, noticing his thoughtful expression. "That day on the trail," he replied, "finding Elizabeth in the dust, reading that note." He shook his head in wonder. "I had no idea my life was about to change forever. That whispering 'bring her home with me' would lead to all of this." Josephine smiled, placing her free hand on her belly as the baby within kicked vigorously. "Our lives are made up of moments that seem small at the time but change everything. Finding Elizabeth, meeting each other." Her smile widened, falling in love. "The best change of all," Matthew said, leaning over to kiss her gently. They're kissing again." Elizabeth's voice rang out as she and James approached the porch, both children sweaty and grass-stained from their play. Matthew laughed, breaking away from Josephine to scoop James up as the boy climbed the porch steps. "That's right, and you'd better get used to it. I plan on kissing your mother for at least the next 50 years. 50 years is forever," Elizabeth declared, climbing into Josephine's lap carefully, mindful of her mother's belly. "Not long enough," Matthew replied, meeting Josephine's eyes over their children's heads. "Not nearly long enough." As the sun disappeared below the horizon, the Callahan family sat together on their porch, surrounded by the love that had begun with a baby found in the dust, a hastily written note, and a cowboy's whispered promise to bring her home. In the years to come, they would face challenges and celebrate triumphs. They would welcome their third child, a girl they named Charlotte, after the woman whose selfless love had made their family possible. They would watch their children grow, help them navigate life's complexities, and eventually see them build families of their own. Through it all, Matthew and Josephine would remain each other's strength and solace. their love deepening with each passing year. And on quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the ranch was peaceful, they would sometimes speak of that fateful day when a desperate act of love by one mother had created the possibility for their family to exist. "It was the beginning of everything," Josephine would say, her head on Matthew's shoulder as they sat on the same porch where they had spent so many evenings. And Matthew, his arm around the woman who had made his life complete, would nod and reply, "The best beginning I could have ever imagined." For in the vast expanse of the Texas frontier, among cattle drives and dusty trails, they had found something rare and precious, a love born of compassion, strengthened by challenge, and destined to last a lifetime. A love that had transformed a lonely cowboy, a heartbroken schoolteacher, and an abandoned baby into a family bound not by blood, but by choice, the most powerful bond of all.